A police officer stands in the hospital room, his gaze cold and fixed on the newborn lying beside a woman who has just endured the pains of childbirth. He doesn't hide his disdain, his suspicion, his judgment. She feels it like a wave crashing over her, drowning her in humiliation and disbelief. She clutches her baby tighter, trying to shield her child from the chilling presence in the room. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," the officer demands, his tone sharp and laced with authority. "I have reason to believe there's a problem here. This child, he might not even belong to you." Her heart pounds, her pulse racing with a combination of fear and outrage. She knows exactly what he's implying, and it's not just about her child, it's about her. She's black, she's vulnerable, and in his eyes, she doesn't belong in this pristine, sterile room. She fights the urge to scream, to push back, but instead, she steadies her voice, keeping her emotions under control. "My child," she replies, holding her head high despite the quiver in her voice. "This is my child. What gives you the right to say otherwise?" The officer's eyes narrow, and he smirks, a hint of mockery in his expression. He steps closer, his badge glinting in the dim hospital light, a symbol of authority and, in this moment, intimidation. "You don't look like you can take care of a child." "Not properly, anyway," he sneers, inspecting her from head to toe, his gaze lingering on her tired, worn face. "We need to make sure this baby goes to a safe, stable home." The words hit her like a blow to the chest, an accusation cloaked in concern but dripping with prejudice. She swallows hard, trying to keep her composure, but the sting of his words digs deep. He's not just questioning her ability to mother, he's questioning her very worth, her identity. A familiar, unspoken narrative: she's a black woman in a place where he believes she doesn't belong, and to him, that's enough. She finds herself struggling to breathe as he continues, twisting the knife with every word. "I've seen cases like this too many times," he says dismissively, glancing toward the door as if summoning backup. "Kids born into circumstances where they're better off without the mess they were brought into." He's making no attempt to hide his bias now, no effort to disguise his disdain. In this moment, he's taken her humanity, her dignity, and crushed it under the weight of his authority. Her heart screams against the injustice, every fiber of her being aching to protect her child from this man who sees them both as nothing more than statistics, cases, or burdens. She wants to shout back, to tell him who she is, that she and her husband have worked their whole lives to provide a stable, loving home for this child. But her voice fails her, caught in the trap of years of fighting against unspoken biases, of knowing that her words, her truths, may fall on deaf ears. But then he leans in closer, and his voice drops to a near whisper, the venom in his tone unmistakable. "If I decide you're not fit to care for this baby, I'll make sure he's placed somewhere, safer. Somewhere he won't have to grow up around the likes of you." She's frozen, the audacity, the cruelty of his words sinking in, leaving her paralyzed with anger and fear. But in her silence, her mind races, the need for justice, for protection igniting within her. She can't allow this man, this stranger with a badge, to steal away the most precious thing in her life. As she stands there, holding her child with trembling arms, a new kind of resolve builds within her. She can't, won't, let him take her baby. And she's not alone in this fight, she reminds herself. The strength of her husband, her family, and everything she's fought for burns within her, fueling a fire she didn't know she had. The officer, however, seems oblivious to her defiance, already reaching toward his radio, signaling for more authority, more power to back up his intent. "You don't have a choice in this," he says smugly, as if her silence has granted him permission to continue his plan. But then, something shifts. In the hallway, footsteps echo, a strong, determined stride approaching the room. Her heart races with a mix of hope and uncertainty. She knows that sound, it's her husband, her rock, the man who has been by her side through every trial, and who, unbeknownst to the officer, holds a badge of his own. But his badge means something different. His badge is a symbol of justice, integrity, a badge that won't be tarnished by prejudice. The officer doesn't notice, too absorbed in his power trip, as he rattles off policies and procedures, already envisioning himself as a hero saving an innocent child from an unfit mother. But her husband's voice cuts through his words like a blade, steady, authoritative, and chilling. Is there a problem here? The officer spins around, his eyes narrowing as he sizes up the newcomer, but there's a shift in his posture, a slight hesitation. Something about this man's stance, his presence, sends a ripple of discomfort through the officer. He tries to mask it, to maintain his control, but the woman can see it. This moment, this unexpected turn, has disrupted his confidence. "What's your business here?" the officer retorts, trying to sound firm, but there's a crack in his tone. He's not prepared for what's about to unfold, for the man standing in front of him to wield a power he underestimated. "My business," the husband replies, his voice low and unwavering. He steps forward, his eyes blazing with a quiet fury, and the officer's smugness falters, just a fraction. "My business is making sure justice is served. My business is protecting my family." And in that moment, the officer begins to realize that he's not in control anymore, that his authority, his badge, won't shield him from the consequences he so carelessly dismissed. The tables are turning, and the woman can feel it, a surge of hope rising within her. She clutches her baby tighter, her breath steadier now as she watches her husband stand firm, his resolve radiating through the room. What will happen next? How far will this confrontation go? And will justice finally be served? At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. We recognize the challenges that many face daily and want to be a space where these stories find justice, truth, and hope. We hope this story brings a sense of support and solidarity, reminding you that everyone deserves respect and fairness. Enjoy the story, and if you want more tales of karma and transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Have a powerful experience. The early morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting a soft glow over the room. Olivia sat up in the hospital bed, exhausted yet filled with a quiet, protective joy as she gazed down at the tiny life she now held in her arms. This was her first child, a baby boy she had longed for and dreamed of. Every ounce of fatigue, every painful contraction, all of it melted away the moment she held him close. She watched him sleep, tiny fists balled up, his little chest rising and falling. He was perfect, pure, and full of promise. Her son represented not only the love she and her husband had for each other but the resilience of their journey together. Olivia came from a modest background. Growing up, she faced her share of hardships, particularly as a black woman navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcomed. But she was strong, determined, and had learned early on how to hold her head high, even when the world tried to bring her down. Education had been her refuge, and after years of hard work, she'd carved out a career in community outreach, working with underprivileged youth. Her compassion for others was her strength, but it also made her sensitive to injustice, especially when it targeted those who were vulnerable. Her husband, Michael, admired her for this. He often told her she had a warrior's heart, and that's exactly how he treated her, like his warrior queen. Michael, her husband, was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Standing tall with a solid, quiet strength, he had a presence that commanded respect. As an FBI agent, Michael had dedicated his life to upholding justice and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His work was grueling and demanding, but he never allowed it to compromise his values. His integrity was his compass, and Olivia was his anchor. They were a team, always had been, bound by trust, mutual respect, and a shared vision for the kind of world they wanted to build for their child. Michael had been Olivia's rock throughout her pregnancy, attending every appointment, soothing her fears, and sharing in her excitement. They'd imagined this day for months, eagerly anticipating their son's arrival, and now that he was here, it felt surreal. The hospital room was silent save for the gentle hum of machinery and the quiet shuffling of nurses outside the door. Olivia had spent the past few hours holding her son close, marveling at every tiny feature, wondering how she'd been blessed with someone so perfect. Michael had stepped out for a moment to handle a call from work, promising he'd be back soon. In the meantime, Olivia felt an overwhelming sense of peace, her focus entirely on the new life in her arms. But that peace was interrupted by the sudden entrance of a man Olivia had never seen before. His uniform marked him as a police officer, his badge glinting under the harsh fluorescent light as he stepped inside, his gaze fixed on her with a scrutinizing intensity that made her instantly uncomfortable. He was tall, with a stocky build, and his eyes held an unsettling coldness that set Olivia on edge. She shifted instinctively, pulling her baby closer, sensing that this man wasn't here with good intentions. "Ma'am," he began, his tone brusque, "I'm Officer Harris. I'm here to check on a few things regarding your situation." "My situation?" Olivia echoed, eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She hadn't expected any sort of check-in from the police, especially not so abruptly, and without explanation. She thought it might be standard procedure, though it didn't feel that way. But she tried to keep calm, not wanting to draw any undue attention to herself or her baby. "Yes," he replied, his tone shifting from neutral to something harsher, almost condescending. "I'm here to make sure everything's in order. This child's safety, specifically." The words felt like a slap. Why would he be questioning her child's safety? What did he mean by in order? Olivia's mind raced, but she kept her expression composed, hoping to defuse whatever assumptions he might be making. "There's nothing to be concerned about, officer," she replied, her voice as steady as she could manage. "My husband and I are more than prepared to take care of our son." He raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Your husband? And where might he be?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as if the answer itself would prove his suspicions. "He's on a call," Olivia said, her patience thinning. "He'll be back soon." Officer Harris crossed his arms, his stance wide and imposing as he eyed her and the baby with a kind of judgment that felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. "I see. And I'm assuming you have all the necessary documents to verify everything about this situation? I need to make sure there's no confusion about custody." Confusion about custody? The insinuation burned in Olivia's mind. She wasn't some stranger to her own child. What was this man implying? Her jaw tightened, her patience wearing thin as she struggled to hold back her anger. "Yes, officer," she answered, fighting to keep her voice level. "Everything is in order. I have all the necessary paperwork. This is my son, and I don't see why there would be any question about that." But Harris didn't relent. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze hardening as he continued to scrutinize her, his posture suggesting that he didn't believe a word she was saying. "Look, Ms., I didn't catch your last name." "Williams," she replied, her voice cold now. She wasn't about to give him anything more than what was required. "Right, Ms. Williams." He let her name hang in the air, as if it was an accusation in itself. "I've seen situations like this too many times. Kids born into complicated circumstances, you could say. Sometimes, they're better off elsewhere, in environments that can provide proper care, structure, safety." Olivia felt her heart clench as his words seeped in, their meaning clear despite the veiled language. He was questioning her worthiness as a mother, her capability to provide for her child. The injustice of it all, the audacity to imply that she, a black woman, couldn't possibly be a fit parent, each word was a knife, cutting into her pride, her dignity. "My husband and I can provide a safe, loving home," she said, her voice tinged with anger she couldn't fully hide. "There's no need to suggest otherwise." Harris let out a small, humorless chuckle, as though her response was a futile protest, nothing more than noise. "We'll see about that. These things have a way of sorting themselves out, Ms. Williams. And I have ways of making sure that the right choice is made, even if it's not the easy one." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. Olivia felt her grip on her son tighten, her mind racing with thoughts of how quickly things had spiraled into this nightmare. Her child, her perfect, innocent child, was being treated like a piece of property to be inspected, judged, and taken away at the whim of this man who looked down on her with undisguised contempt. And then, in that moment of despair, she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. A voice, steady and strong, cut through her rising panic. "Is there an issue here?" It was Michael, standing in the doorway, his figure solid and reassuring. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, instantly assessing the situation as he moved closer to Olivia's side. She saw the subtle shift in his expression as he recognized the tension in the room, the subtle clenching of his jaw as he picked up on the threat hanging in the air. Officer Harris turned, his expression one of faint irritation as he sized up the newcomer. He seemed momentarily taken aback, as though he hadn't expected anyone to challenge his authority in that room. But Michael's presence was like a wall, an unyielding force that Harris couldn't simply brush aside. "Who are you?" Harris asked, his voice tinged with defensiveness as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I'm her husband," Michael replied, his voice calm but unyielding. He stepped between Harris and Olivia, his gaze never wavering. "And I'd like to know why you're questioning my wife and our child without any grounds." There was a beat of silence, a tension-filled moment where Olivia felt the power dynamics shift. Harris, faced with Michael's unrelenting stance, faltered for a split second, his confidence shaken. But the hostility in his eyes didn't wane. If anything, it grew sharper, as though Michael's mere presence was an affront to his authority. "Just doing my duty," Harris replied, his voice cold. "We have protocols to ensure the safety of children, especially in situations like this." "Situations like what?" Michael's voice was measured, but there was an edge to it that even Harris couldn't ignore. Michael's experience as an FBI agent had trained him to read people, to detect threats beneath the surface, and he saw right through Harris's thinly veiled prejudice. The tension in the room grew thicker, a silent battle of wills playing out between Michael and Harris. Olivia felt a surge of gratitude for her husband, for his strength and calm, even as she clung to her child with renewed determination. She knew they weren't out of danger yet, that this confrontation was only beginning. But with Michael by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of resistance that pushed back against the fear and injustice that had invaded their lives. Yet, as the room fell into silence, Olivia knew that this fight was far from over. Michael stood firm between Olivia and Officer Harris, his posture calm but unyielding, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. Olivia could feel the tension radiating off him, the protective energy that gave her strength as she held their child closer. The sterile hospital room felt like a battleground, every corner filled with unspoken words, every breath heavy with the clash of authority and the instinctive need to protect. This was their child, and the man standing in front of them had no right to question that. But Officer Harris wasn't ready to back down, his gaze flickering between the baby, Olivia, and Michael, as though calculating his next move. The officer's face hardened, and he squared his shoulders, clearly determined to maintain control. He spoke with a tone meant to command, but Michael's steady presence seemed to disrupt his rhythm. "I don't know who you think you are," Harris said, his voice cold, "but I'm following protocol, making sure the child's welfare is in order. The hospital has a responsibility here, and so do I." Michael didn't blink. "I know exactly what your responsibilities are, Officer Harris. And right now, you're overstepping them." Harris's jaw tightened, and Olivia felt his anger sharpen, a mixture of frustration and indignation flaring up behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by a man who stood as his equal, if not his superior, in terms of authority. But Michael didn't give him the satisfaction of backing down, not even a fraction. Olivia could feel the room's temperature drop as Harris struggled to assert himself in the face of her husband's unshakable resolve. "And what do you do, exactly?" Harris asked, feigning curiosity, but Olivia heard the thinly veiled contempt in his tone. He was probing, trying to break down Michael's calm exterior. You think you know more about what's best for this child than someone with the proper training? Michael's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a steely edge. I'm not just someone. I'm his father. And that's all you need to know. The words hung in the air, each syllable cutting through the room like a blade. Harris's face twisted slightly, a flicker of resentment flashing in his eyes, but he quickly masked it. Olivia could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating, strategizing, his gaze shifting once more toward her, as though seeking a crack in the strength Michael had brought into the room. Look, Harris began, softening his tone but not his intent, we're just being cautious. Situations like this are delicate. We have to think about what's best for the child in the long run. And that sometimes means making tough decisions. Olivia felt her chest tighten, anger and anxiety welling up in her throat. She'd heard these words before, the veiled insinuations, the condescending reassurances that people like her needed help, that their decisions and their worthiness were always subject to scrutiny. But this was her family, her son. And the only people who had the right to make decisions about him were standing right here. What's best for my child? Olivia's voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with barely restrained anger. She fixed her gaze on Harris, refusing to let him see the fear that lurked beneath her outrage. My husband and I are more than capable of making those decisions ourselves. You have no right to stand here and imply otherwise. Harris raised an eyebrow, his mouth curling into a faint smirk as though he'd expected her reaction, even welcomed it. He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping to a patronizing tone that made Olivia's skin crawl. Ma'am, I understand that you believe you're prepared. But this isn't just about what you think. It's about objective safety and ensuring that the right measures are in place. My duty is to make sure that every child in this hospital is protected. Sometimes that means I have to make hard calls. Whether you agree with them or not. Michael's voice came out low, controlled, but Olivia could feel the tension simmering just below the surface. You're speaking about our son as if he's a statistic, an obligation on a checklist. He's our child, Officer Harris. Not a problem for you to solve. The officer sighed, an exaggerated motion meant to convey frustration, as though he was the one being put through an ordeal. He looked back and forth between them, feigning a look of resignation as if dealing with people too stubborn to understand. Fine, Harris said, crossing his arms. But let's be clear here, if there's any indication that this child isn't being properly cared for, I have every right to intervene. And I will. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, but dripping with threat. There's more than one way to remove a child from a situation. I suggest you remember that. The words hit Olivia like a slap, the audacity of his threat leaving her stunned, speechless. She could feel her blood boiling, every instinct screaming at her to fight, to push back, to tell him that he'd never take her son away. But Michael reached over, his hand steady on her arm, grounding her. We've heard what you have to say, officer, Michael replied, his voice steady, unflinching. But I'll be clear too, if you take another step toward my wife or my child, I will do everything within my power to make sure you're held accountable for every word, every action. His gaze bore into Harris, unrelenting. Do you understand me? For the first time, Olivia saw a flicker of doubt cross Harris's face. It was fleeting, quickly replaced by a look of resentment and frustration, but it was there, a crack in his resolve. The officer straightened, forcing his expression back to one of authority, but his gaze shifted, the same coldness in his eyes now directed at Michael. Fine, Harris said with forced indifference, stepping back. But don't think this is over. We'll be keeping a close eye on this situation. He turned toward the door, casting one last look over his shoulder, a silent warning in his gaze before he finally left the room. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the echoes of the confrontation, the lingering tension. Olivia exhaled, her body releasing the tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping as the relief mixed with residual anger and fear. Michael turned to her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, grounding her once more. She looked up at him, and in that moment, she felt a surge of gratitude and love for the man who had stood by her side, unwavering, unafraid. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the authority he'd wielded moments before. Olivia nodded, though her voice came out as a whisper. I can't believe he actually tried to." Michael shook his head, his expression darkening. "Men like him don't see families, don't see love. They see control, power. And he thought he could use that against us." His gaze softened, his hand moving to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "But he was wrong. We're stronger than that." She let out a shaky breath, her fingers clutching the blanket wrapped around her child. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You would have done just fine. I just made it clear to him that he's not as untouchable as he thinks." His voice dropped, the determination evident in his tone. "This isn't over, Olivia. He may try something again. We need to be ready." Olivia nodded, her resolve hardening once more. She could feel the strength of Michael's words, his steady, unwavering confidence filling her with a renewed sense of determination. This was their family, and they weren't going to let anyone tear it apart. They spent the next few hours in relative peace, though the memory of Harris's threat lingered like a dark cloud over them. Every time a nurse entered, Olivia felt a jolt of fear, wondering if it was another official visit under the guise of a routine check. But the staff seemed respectful, professional, and as the minutes ticked by, she began to let her guard down, even if just a little. Then, as the afternoon wore on, Olivia noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Nurses and staff exchanged quick glances, whispers passing between them as they glanced toward their room. Olivia's unease returned, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She looked to Michael, her concern mirrored in his eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice tense. Michael's jaw clenched. "I don't know. But I'll find out." He stepped out into the hallway, his tall frame moving with a purpose that demanded attention. Olivia watched as he spoke with one of the nurses, his voice low but firm, and she saw the nurse nod, her expression serious as she relayed information. Olivia's heart pounded, her anxiety rising as she waited, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, Michael returned, his face set in a grim expression. He closed the door gently, his gaze meeting hers, and she could see the turmoil in his eyes. "They're trying to bring in social services," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Apparently, there's been a complaint about the safety of the child." Olivia's blood ran cold. "A complaint? From who? We haven't done anything wrong." Michael's jaw tightened. "It's him. Harris. He's making sure his threat isn't empty." She felt a wave of anger and fear crash over her, a whirlwind of emotions that left her breathless. They were being targeted, watched, as though they were criminals. It was a nightmare, a violation of everything they'd worked for, everything they believed in. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "How do we stop this?" Michael's gaze hardened, a quiet fury burning behind his eyes. "We fight. We gather every piece of evidence, every witness, every person who's seen the way he's treated us. We make sure he knows we won't back down." His voice softened as he reached out, taking her hand in his touch steady and reassuring. "We won't let him take what's ours, Olivia. Not now, not ever." She felt a flicker of hope amidst the fear, a spark that grew with every word he spoke. They were stronger than Harris's threats, stronger than his prejudice. And together, they would find a way to protect their family. But as they prepared for the battle ahead, one lingering question remained in Olivia's mind, a question that sent chills down her spine as she realized just how far Harris might be willing to go. Just how much power did he think he had? In the quiet confines of the hospital room, Olivia could feel a storm brewing. The air was thick with tension, and every footstep in the hallway sent a wave of apprehension through her. Her son lay bundled in her arms, his small breaths a fragile rhythm amidst the growing turmoil. Michael had been on edge since he heard about the complaint, but his determination was as steady as ever. Olivia knew he would protect them with everything he had. Then, just as she was beginning to hope that they might weather this without further incident, there was a firm knock on the door. Olivia felt her breath catch. Michael turned toward the door, his face set in a mask of calm resolve. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before opening it. In walked Officer Harris, followed by two figures who, judging by their clinical expressions and attire, were clearly social services agents. Harris's expression was smug, as if he'd won a battle no one else was aware they were fighting. Olivia tightened her grip on her baby, her heart pounding. She saw the flash of anger in Michael's eyes as he shut the door behind them, positioning himself between Olivia and the intruders. Harris surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Olivia and the baby before he spoke, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "Well, it looks like everyone's here. Good. Saves us all some time." He gestured to the agents beside him. "These are representatives from social services. They're here to make sure the child is in safe hands." Michael took a step forward, his voice calm but laced with restrained anger. "What do you think you're doing, Officer Harris? You have no grounds for bringing in social services, no evidence that there's any issue here." Harris tilted his head, his expression feigning concern. "That's where you're wrong. We received a tip, a concerned report that the child might not be in the safest environment." He glanced at Olivia, a flicker of disdain passing through his eyes. "It's our duty to follow up on these things, you understand." Olivia felt a surge of anger, but Michael placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. One of the social workers stepped forward, adjusting her clipboard as she addressed Michael. "We understand this is a difficult situation, but we do need to assess for ourselves. It's standard procedure to ensure the safety of the child." Michael's jaw clenched. He turned his gaze to the social worker, his voice steady. "Standard procedure doesn't involve barging into a family's room without any evidence of wrongdoing. If this officer had any legitimate concerns, he should have followed proper channels." The social worker shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Harris before looking back at Michael. "We were informed that there was cause for concern. We're simply here to verify that the child is safe." "Safe?" Olivia couldn't keep silent any longer. Her voice shook with anger as she looked directly at Harris. "You think bringing in strangers to question us in a hospital room is safe? This is harassment, plain and simple." Harris let out a low chuckle, his gaze never wavering from hers. "Harassment? We're just doing our job, ma'am. Maybe if you had a more stable environment, we wouldn't need to be here." Michael's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice controlled. "Stable environment? We've done nothing to deserve this. You're overstepping your authority, officer." Harris's expression hardened. "Watch your tone. I'm simply here to ensure the safety of a child. You have a problem with that?" Michael took a deep breath, his voice unwavering. "I don't have a problem with ensuring safety. But I do have a problem with someone using their position to intimidate and harass a family." The tension in the room was palpable, a silent battle of wills playing out as everyone held their breath. One of the social workers cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the hostility in the air. "Perhaps we could speak privately," she suggested, looking at Michael and Olivia. "It might help to clarify things and resolve this matter." Michael nodded, though his gaze never left Harris. "That would be fine. But Officer Harris has no reason to be here for this discussion. His presence is unnecessary and unprofessional." Harris's smirk faded slightly, a glimmer of frustration creeping into his expression. But before he could respond, one of the social workers nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "We can handle this from here, officer." Thank you for bringing this to our attention, but we'll take it from here. Harris hesitated, his jaw tightening as he looked between Michael, Olivia, and the social workers. It was clear he didn't want to relinquish control, but he knew he had no choice. With one last lingering look, he turned to leave, his voice dripping with thinly veiled menace as he spoke. I'll be watching closely. Don't think this is over. As the door closed behind him, Olivia let out a shaky breath, her heart still pounding from the intensity of the encounter. The social workers looked at her with sympathetic eyes, clearly aware of the toll this was taking on her. We're truly sorry for the intrusion, one of them began, her voice soft. We understand this is a difficult time for you both. Michael's gaze softened slightly, his anger tempered by a need to ensure Olivia felt safe. He took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Thank you for your understanding. But we need to be clear, this tip is based on nothing but prejudice. The social worker nodded, her expression serious. We're here to support families, not tear them apart. We'll review the situation thoroughly, but from what we've seen so far, there doesn't appear to be any concern. Michael let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you. That's all we ask, for this to be handled fairly and without bias. The social workers asked a few more questions, their approach calm and respectful, a stark contrast to Harris's hostility. Olivia felt herself relax, reassured by their professionalism. They were nothing like Harris, their focus was genuinely on the well-being of the child, not on power or prejudice. After what felt like an eternity, the social workers finally rose to leave, assuring them that they saw no reason for further action. Olivia's heart swelled with relief, the weight of the ordeal lifting slightly as she watched them go. Michael wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as they sat in silence, letting the tension slowly dissolve. But their relief was short-lived. Just as they began to relax, the door swung open once more, and there stood Officer Harris, a twisted look of satisfaction on his face. Olivia's heart sank. She didn't understand, she thought the matter had been settled. Back so soon. Michael's voice was cold, his eyes narrowed as he met Harris's gaze. The social workers were clear, they found no grounds for concern. Harris's smirk grew wider, his tone dripping with feigned sympathy. Oh, I'm aware. But you see, I have friends in high places. It seems there's a need for further investigation. Michael's fists clenched at his sides, the fury barely contained as he stepped closer to Harris, his voice low and filled with warning. What exactly do you think you're trying to accomplish here, officer? Harris shrugged, unfazed by the anger in Michael's eyes. I'm just doing my job. Making sure there's no risk involved. Olivia could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, her fear overshadowed by the burning injustice of it all. She took a step forward, her voice trembling but defiant. You have no right to harass us like this. We're a family, and we deserve respect. Harris's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Olivia with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Respect? I'll decide when respect is warranted. It was in that moment, as Olivia looked at the man who had torn into her most precious moment, who had turned the birth of her child into a nightmare, that she knew they had to do something. This wasn't just a man abusing his power, this was a man who saw them as lesser, who would continue to hunt them down if they didn't put a stop to it. Michael turned to Olivia, his gaze softening for a moment, the resolve in his eyes clear. We're not letting him get away with this. Then, a voice rang out from behind them. You might not have to. They all turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a tall man in a suit, his badge glinting in the light. Olivia recognized him immediately as Michael's supervisor, a senior FBI agent who commanded respect. Agent Larson. Harris's confidence faltered slightly, his bravado fading as he realized he'd lost control of the situation. Larson stepped forward, his gaze cold as he took in the scene. I've been following this case closely. And from what I can see, Officer Harris, you've overstepped your bounds. Harris's face paled slightly, but he tried to regain his composure, stammering, I was only doing what was necessary. Ensuring the safety of the child. Safety? Larson's voice was a quiet, dangerous tone. Or was it something else, officer? Harris's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Larson stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Harris's face. You targeted this family, used your position to harass them, to intimidate them. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Olivia felt a surge of hope, a sense of justice finally taking hold. She watched as Harris's confidence crumbled, the arrogant mask slipping as he realized he was no longer in control. Larson turned to Michael and Olivia, his expression softening. I'm sorry you had to endure this. No family should go through this kind of ordeal. Michael nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you, Agent Larson. For everything. Larson nodded in return, then turned back to Harris, his voice firm. Officer Harris, you're officially under investigation. Any further attempts to contact or interfere with this family will result in immediate disciplinary action. Consider this your first and only warning. Harris's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he knew he had no power left in this situation. He turned on his heel and walked out without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the room. In the silence that followed, Olivia felt the weight of relief settle over her, the nightmare finally coming to an end. She looked at Michael, a sense of gratitude and love filling her as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They had faced the storm together, and they had come out stronger. The threat was gone, but the memory lingered, a reminder of the strength they'd found in each other, the resilience they'd built as a family. And as they held their son close, Olivia knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, unbreakable and unafraid. As the door closed behind Officer Harris, leaving only Michael, Olivia, and Agent Larson in the room, the weight of everything that had happened began to sink in. Olivia felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, gratitude, and residual anger simmering just beneath the surface. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she cradled her son, holding him as close as she could, as if to shield him from the events that had unfolded around them. Michael turned to Agent Larson, his face etched with a blend of exhaustion and appreciation. Thank you, Larson. If you hadn't come when you did, I don't know how much longer we could have endured his threats. Larson nodded, his expression solemn as he took in the lingering tension in the room. Michael, Olivia, I'm sorry it went this far. No family should ever have to face that kind of treatment, especially during such a vulnerable time. Harris's behavior was reprehensible, and I assure you, he will be held accountable for every action he took today. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked up at Larson. Thank you. I didn't know if anyone would believe us, if anyone would see what he was really doing. Larson's gaze softened as he looked at her, his tone firm but reassuring. You're not alone, Olivia. Men like Harris believe they're untouchable, that they can use their authority to impose their own prejudices on others. But as of today, his power over you ends. He'll face an internal investigation, and given the severity of his actions, I expect he'll be removed from his position. Michael's shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like hours, though his voice still carried the edge of residual anger. It's hard to believe he was able to act this way for so long without anyone stopping him. He seemed so certain he could get away with it, even in front of social workers, without consequence. Larson's expression turned grim. Unfortunately, there are people like him who manage to slip through the cracks. But that stops now. He misused his position to intimidate and threaten an innocent family, and he'll answer for it. There was a moment of silence as Olivia absorbed Larson's words. She looked down at her son, a tear slipping down her cheek as she gently stroked his tiny face, feeling a wave of protectiveness wash over her. This little life she held in her arms was everything, and she had come so close to having him torn away by a man who saw them as nothing more than obstacles in his path. Michael noticed the tear, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. "Hey," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with unwavering support. "It's over. He can't hurt us anymore." Olivia nodded, though her voice shook slightly as she replied, I can't believe it came to this. That he thought he had the right to take away our child. I've never felt so helpless." Larson, hearing the depth of emotion in her voice, stepped closer, his own voice filled with empathy. "No one should have to feel that way, Olivia. People like Harris thrive on instilling fear, on making others feel powerless. But you didn't give in. You stood your ground, and you protected your son with everything you had." She looked up, meeting his gaze, the gratitude in her eyes evident. "Thank you, Agent Larson. For believing in us, for stepping in when you did. I don't know what we would have done without you." Larson offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. You were brave, and you have a good man by your side. Michael's loyalty and strength are what brought me here. And together, the two of you were able to withstand something that most people shouldn't even have to imagine." Michael looked down, his jaw tightening as he thought about the ordeal they'd endured. "I wanted to stop him the moment he walked in here, but I knew that would only make things worse. Every part of me was screaming to stand up to him, but I couldn't risk putting you or our son in any more danger." Olivia placed a hand on his, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "You did exactly what we needed, Michael. You protected us by keeping calm, by not letting him see how much he was getting to us." Her voice dropped, filled with the weight of her gratitude. "You saved us, Michael. Both you and Agent Larson." Michael nodded, a faint smile crossing his face, but Olivia could see the remnants of anger and frustration in his eyes. Larson noticed too, his voice gentle as he addressed him. "Michael, I understand how hard this must be. You've spent your life upholding justice, and today, you saw it being perverted right in front of you. But sometimes, the greatest strength lies in restraint. You protected your family by keeping your cool, by not letting him bait you into a reaction." Michael met Larson's gaze, his voice steady. "It's hard to feel like you're protecting when all you want to do is fight back. But I knew he wanted us to lose control. He wanted an excuse to turn this into something even worse. And I wasn't going to give him that." Larson nodded, understanding. "You did the right thing. By staying composed, you took away his power. People like Harris feed off fear, off the chaos they create. But when you refuse to give in to their manipulation, they lose control." Olivia looked down at her son, her voice soft but determined. "We won't let him have that power over us ever again. Our son deserves a life without fear, without people like Harris trying to tear him down just because of who we are." Michael placed an arm around her, his voice filled with resolve. "And that's exactly the life we're going to give him. No one, especially someone like Harris, is ever going to make us feel powerless again." Larson took a step back, nodding in agreement. "You both have faced something incredibly difficult, and you've come out stronger. The road won't be easy, but you have each other, and that's a strength no one can take from you." There was a pause, a shared silence as they all absorbed the enormity of what had happened, the relief of knowing that Harris's threats no longer loomed over them. But then Larson looked up, his gaze sharpening slightly, a hint of seriousness returning to his voice. "There's one more thing I wanted to discuss with you both before I go." Michael exchanged a glance with Olivia, his expression curious but cautious. "What is it?" Larson hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "There's a formal investigation being opened against Harris, as I mentioned. But the FBI will likely reach out to you both as part of this process. They'll want statements, details of everything he said and did. It could be difficult, but it's important that the truth is fully documented." Olivia's grip on Michael's hand tightened, a slight apprehension flickering in her eyes. Will this mean more attention on us? More questions?" Larson nodded, his voice gentle but honest. It's possible. An investigation like this will bring some scrutiny, especially given the seriousness of the accusations. But I want you both to know that you'll have support throughout. The agency takes these matters very seriously, and you'll be protected during the process. Michael nodded, his expression resolute. If it means making sure someone like Harris never does this to anyone else, we'll do whatever it takes. Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself before she replied, we'll do it. For our son, for our family. And for anyone else who might have suffered because of him. Larson gave them both a small, respectful nod. I know this won't be easy. But your courage today will make a difference, not just for yourselves but for others. Thank you, both of you, for standing up. With a final nod, Larson turned to leave, his presence lingering even after he'd gone, a reminder that they were no longer alone in this fight. Olivia looked up at Michael, a sense of exhaustion mingling with relief as she let out a shaky breath. It's over, Michael, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's really over. Michael pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Yes, it is. And from now on, we focus on us, on building the life we want for our family. We're free from him, Olivia. Free to move forward. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief and overwhelming love as she held their son between them, feeling the warmth of Michael's embrace. They stood there in the quiet hospital room, letting the silence wash over them, grounding them in the reality that they had weathered the storm together. And as they held each other, Olivia felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace that whispered of new beginnings, of a future unmarred by fear or intimidation. They had come through the fire, and they were stronger, united, unbreakable. For their son, for themselves, they had reclaimed their lives. And as they looked forward, they knew that no force, no prejudice, would ever break them again. In the hours that followed Harris's departure and Agent Larson's reassurance, the reality of the ordeal slowly began to settle in for Olivia and Michael. The hospital room, which had been the center of so much tension, now felt quieter, almost serene, but there was a weight lingering in the air, an awareness of what they had just endured, and the long shadows it cast over their lives. They were free of Harris's immediate threats, but his actions had left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. Michael sat beside Olivia, one arm draped protectively around her shoulders as she held their newborn son close. The intensity of everything they had gone through hadn't fully subsided, and the gravity of what lay ahead began to sink in. They knew that the investigation into Harris would bring scrutiny, that the FBI would be asking for every detail, every interaction, every piece of evidence they had to support their claims. And although Olivia wanted nothing more than to put the experience behind them, she understood the importance of seeing it through, of standing up against a man who had abused his authority in the most personal way. As evening began to fall, Olivia's mind replayed the events over and over, lingering on every word Harris had said, every condescending look, every threat wrapped in a veil of official duty. She couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the sense that their family had been targeted for something as simple as who they were. She turned to Michael, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke, filled with lingering disbelief and hurt. Do you think it will really change anything, Michael? I mean, pressing charges, going through all of this. Will it make a difference? Michael met her gaze, his eyes steady and filled with conviction. Yes, Olivia. It will. Maybe we can't undo what he put us through, but by standing up to him, by making sure he's held accountable, we're protecting others from experiencing the same thing. No one should have the power to treat people the way he did, not without consequences. She nodded, though a hint of doubt remained in her heart. But what if they don't believe us? What if they think we're just exaggerating, or that it's not as serious as we say? Michael reached out, taking her hand in his grip gentle but firm. They'll believe us, Olivia. And even if there are those who try to dismiss what happened, we have each other, and we have the truth on our side. What Harris did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal, immoral. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're standing up for everyone who's ever been mistreated by people like him. His words resonated with her, giving her strength, though the reality of the task ahead was daunting. The process would be long and grueling. There would be questions, scrutiny, perhaps even backlash from those who didn't want to acknowledge the existence of prejudice in the very institutions meant to protect them. She knew there would be people who would doubt their story, who would accuse them of misunderstanding or exaggerating Harris's intentions. But Michael's confidence, his unwavering resolve, fortified her, reminding her of the importance of their fight. In the midst of their silent reflection, there was another knock at the door, a gentle but firm sound that made both of them tense momentarily. Michael stood, instinctively protective, and opened the door. To their surprise, a nurse entered, her expression sympathetic and kind, carrying a tray with 2 warm drinks and a small note folded beside them. "I just wanted to bring you both something to help you relax," she said, her voice soft. "You've been through a lot today. We've all been keeping you in our thoughts." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she whispered, managing a small smile. She took the note, unfolding it with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. The message was brief but sincere: "Your strength doesn't go unnoticed. Some of us see more than you think. We stand with you." Olivia looked up, meeting the nurse's gaze. There was a silent understanding there, a shared recognition of the complexities and unspoken struggles that people like her faced. In that moment, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that they weren't alone, that there were people who saw them, who understood their fight. As the nurse left, Michael sat back down beside her, reading the note over her shoulder, his expression softening. "Sometimes," he murmured, "it's the small reminders that mean the most." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, letting the quiet moments ground them, allowing themselves to feel the relief and support they hadn't anticipated. But the respite was short-lived as Michael's phone buzzed, breaking the calm. He checked the message, his face growing serious as he read the details. "It's Larson," he explained, showing Olivia the screen. "He wants us to come in for an official statement tomorrow. They're starting the formal investigation." Olivia took a deep breath, nodding slowly as she processed the news. "I suppose it was only a matter of time. We knew this was coming." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression firm. "We'll handle it together. They need to hear our side, and we'll make sure they do. We're not backing down." The next day came quickly, and Olivia found herself seated across from a panel of officials, the sterile environment of the FBI office adding to the weight of the situation. She felt Michael's hand squeeze hers under the table, a silent reminder of his presence, his unwavering support. Agent Larson sat across from them, flanked by 2 other agents, each with notepads and a steady, observant gaze. The lead investigator, a woman with a calm yet piercing look, spoke first, her voice professional but not unkind. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, thank you for coming in today. We're here to gather a full account of the events involving Officer Harris. We understand this has been a difficult experience, and we appreciate your cooperation." Olivia nodded, her voice quiet but steady as she replied. "We just want to make sure no one else has to go through this. What he did to us, to our family, it was more than just a misunderstanding. It was targeted, personal." The investigator gave a nod of understanding. "Please, take your time. We want to hear every detail, from the moment Officer Harris entered the hospital room to the confrontation with social services." Michael took the lead, recounting the events in a clear, precise manner, each word carefully chosen. He described the way Harris had looked at them, the thinly veiled contempt in his eyes, the way he had spoken to Olivia as though she were less than human. As he spoke, Olivia watched the expressions of the agents across the table, noticing the subtle shifts in their faces as they took in the gravity of what they were hearing. When it was her turn to speak, Olivia's voice was calm but filled with an intensity that spoke of the pain, the fear, and the strength it had taken to withstand Harris's harassment. She recounted the fear she had felt, the way her heart had raced as Harris insinuated that her child would be taken from her, the feeling of helplessness that had nearly overtaken her. "There was no reason for him to treat us the way he did," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly. "I kept asking myself, why us? Why did he feel the need to assert his power in that way, to threaten a new mother holding her newborn? We were no threat to him. But he saw us as one." The investigator listened intently, her face impassive but her eyes focused, absorbing every word. She glanced down at her notes, then back up at Olivia and Michael, her tone softening slightly as she responded. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Williams, I can assure you that your statements will be taken seriously. Officer Harris's behavior was unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that justice is served. However, I also need to be upfront with you, this process may be lengthy. Cases involving abuse of authority are complex, and there may be setbacks." Michael's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his voice unwavering. "We understand. We're prepared to see this through, no matter how long it takes." Olivia felt a surge of pride at his words, at his unwavering commitment to their cause. She knew that this would be a challenging journey, that they would face scrutiny, doubt, and perhaps even pushback from those who didn't want to acknowledge the flaws in the system. But she also knew that they had each other, that they were united in their resolve to stand up against injustice. The lead investigator finished taking notes, her expression thoughtful as she looked back at them. "Thank you both for your courage. We'll be in touch with further updates as the investigation proceeds. In the meantime, if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to reach out." As they left the office, stepping back into the bright afternoon sunlight, Olivia took a deep breath, feeling a sense of release. The weight of sharing their story, of being heard, was both exhausting and empowering. Michael wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close as they walked back to the car. "We did it," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We took the first step." Olivia looked up at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Yes, we did. And no matter what happens, we know we did the right thing." They drove home in silence, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket. But amidst the fatigue and uncertainty, there was a newfound sense of purpose, a feeling that they had taken control of their own story. They weren't just victims of Harris's abuse, they were fighters, standing up for themselves and for others who had been mistreated. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Harris unfolded, bringing to light details that shocked even Olivia and Michael. Other families, other individuals who had been subjected to Harris's prejudice, came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation and discrimination. The case began to gain attention, a growing awareness that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of abuse. Through it all, Olivia and Michael remained steadfast, attending hearings, speaking with investigators, and sharing their story with a courage that inspired those around them. Their experience, though painful, became a beacon of hope for others, a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of standing up against injustice. And as the case moved forward, as the public began to demand accountability, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope that their story, their struggle, would bring about real change. But she also knew that the fight was far from over, that they still had a long road ahead. And as they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that no matter how dark the path might seem, the light of justice would guide them forward. As the investigation into Officer Harris progressed, the gravity of his misconduct became increasingly apparent. Testimonies from other victims surfaced, each one adding another layer to the case, painting a picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. The FBI's internal review concluded that Harris had systematically targeted and intimidated individuals he deemed unfit, often leveraging his position to instill fear and compliance. The weight of his actions, combined with the courage of Olivia, Michael, and others who came forward, led to Harris's swift dismissal from the force. However, the consequences went even further. As more people spoke out, the story gained media attention, sparking a national conversation on the importance of accountability within law enforcement. Harris's case became a symbol of both the abuse of power and the strength of those who stood up to it. Under mounting pressure, the department initiated new policies and training programs aimed at preventing similar abuses, marking a small but significant step forward. For Olivia and Michael, the outcome was both a victory and a relief. Their voices had been heard, their pain acknowledged, and justice was served. But the journey had left its mark. The experience had been deeply unsettling, shaking their faith in the very systems meant to protect them. Yet, through it all, they emerged stronger and more united, their bond as a family unbreakable. Several months after the investigation concluded, Olivia and Michael returned to their life, finding a new normal, free from the lingering shadow of Harris's threats. Olivia felt a profound shift within herself, a sense of empowerment she hadn't known before. She took her experience and poured it into her work, sharing her story with other mothers, advocating for the rights of those who felt voiceless. Her story inspired others, and soon, she became a spokesperson for community outreach initiatives focused on legal education and support for families facing discrimination. One day, Olivia received an invitation to speak at a public event organized by a civil rights organization. Standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, she recounted her story, the journey from fear to empowerment. She described the uncertainty she had felt, the anger, and ultimately the strength she discovered within herself and her family. Her words resonated with the audience, sparking both tears and applause. She had become not just a survivor of Harris's actions but a symbol of resilience, a woman who had reclaimed her dignity and used her voice to make a difference. Meanwhile, Michael's career took a significant turn. The FBI recognized his unwavering integrity and strength throughout the ordeal, and he was offered a position leading an internal team focused on identifying and addressing misconduct within law enforcement. It was a role that combined his skills as an agent with his personal commitment to justice. Michael accepted the position with pride, knowing that he could contribute to a system he believed in, making it safer and fairer for everyone. He became a respected leader, admired by his colleagues for his dedication and principles. And as for Harris, his life had taken a drastically different path. Stripped of his position and reputation, he found himself ostracized and isolated, his actions forever a stain on his name. He faced legal repercussions for his abuse of power, and the once authoritative figure was now left with the consequences of his own choices. While some would say he got what he deserved, his fall from grace served as a powerful reminder that no one, no matter their rank or influence, was above accountability. Years passed, and Olivia and Michael watched their son grow up in a home filled with love, strength, and resilience. They had vowed to protect him, to ensure he would never feel the fear they had once faced. Their son would grow up knowing that his parents had fought for justice, not only for themselves but for the countless others affected by people like Harris. On a sunny afternoon, as Olivia and Michael sat in their backyard watching their son play, Olivia looked over at Michael, her face filled with peace and gratitude. "We did it," she murmured, a soft smile spreading across her face. "We kept our family safe, and we made a difference." Michael reached over, taking her hand in his. "We did. And we'll keep doing it. For him, for ourselves, and for everyone who deserves to live without fear." They sat in silence, their hands intertwined, knowing that they had not only survived but thrived, their love and determination carrying them through the darkest times. As we reach the end of this story, let's pause and consider what it teaches us. Olivia and Michael's journey reminds us that strength doesn't always come from standing alone. Sometimes, it comes from standing together, from leaning on those who share in our struggles. Their experience speaks to the courage it takes to stand up to abuse, even when the odds seem insurmountable, even when those in power seek to silence us. How often do we, as individuals, witness or experience small injustices? How often do we ignore them, hoping they'll go away? This story challenges us to reflect on our own responses to injustice and to consider the power we hold when we refuse to be silent. Olivia and Michael's victory was not just theirs, it was a victory for everyone who's ever been made to feel powerless or unworthy. Their voices echoed far beyond that hospital room, resonating with people they may never meet but who are nonetheless inspired by their strength. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, then perhaps it's a reminder to look closer, to be vigilant, and to support those who need it. The ripple effects of standing up for what is right are far-reaching, and sometimes, they start with just one voice. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found value in this story, if it resonated with you, please consider subscribing to Tales of Twist for more narratives that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of resilience.